headlines on RT International. Russia and Syria have halted airstrikes in rebel-held Aleppo ahead of a humanitarian pause to let civilians and militants leave safely. That's while the government-held part of the city is regularly shelled from there, killing and wounding civilians.
أنا بدي ترجع أجري.
The US State Department appears to contradict itself on dealing with civilians in Syria's Aleppo and Mosul in Iraq as the US-backed Iraqi army begins a military operation in that ISIL stronghold.
Oh, right, so your account's closed, go away. Thanks very much. Charming.
As NatWest Bank gives notice to close the accounts of RT UK, we get reactions from the street and talk to some high-profile figures. Also, a Muslim American family decides Pakistan is a safer bet than North Carolina after their 7-year-old son claims he was beaten by classmates on a school bus. Your latest worldwide news headlines live on RT International. From me, Rory Souchet, and the entire crew, welcome to your headlines. Russia and Syria have halted airstrikes in Aleppo to prepare for a humanitarian pause which is to take place on Thursday. The news was announced during a meeting of the Russian Defense Ministry.
Starting from 10 o'clock today, Russian and Syrian air forces have halted airstrikes in the Aleppo area. The move is necessary for the launch of a humanitarian pause on the 20th of October.
Let's get details on this right now from RT's Daniel Hawkins, standing by just in front of the Kremlin there, downtown Moscow. Well, what do we know so far, Daniel?
Well, Rory, these airstrikes were initially due to be halted, as we heard there earlier, on Thursday to create a window for those humanitarian operations to take place. But the decision was later changed to stop all military activity in the area 2 days early in the build-up to that operation. So as of this morning, both the Syrian and Russian militaries have halted all military activity in the area. This will allow medical staff to have access to those who are injured and sick, something they haven't been able to do now for many weeks due to that intense fighting. And also, several corridors have been created to enable not only civilians to leave eastern Aleppo to evacuate, but also for any militants to leave, including even with their weapons. So an amnesty, if you like, from the area for any militants. Now, aside from this very crucial chance to provide aid and humanitarian relief to the population, this is also a chance, of course, for a separation of al-Nusra terrorist other groups from the moderate opposition, as proposed, of course, several weeks earlier by Russia at the UN Assembly. Russia's ambassador to the UN, Vitaly Churkin, didn't mince his words, certainly, when he described what options those al-Qaeda affiliated groups had in the city of Aleppo.
We cannot declare Nusra people honorary citizens of Eastern Aleppo or honorary citizens of Aleppo. Something needs to be done about them. One way to deal with them is for the moderate fighters to tell them to go, because they outnumber, Nusra quite considerably. Another way for them is to leave Syria with the arrangements which were proposed by Stefan de Mistura. Or a way must be found to defeat them. They cannot simply be allowed to stay there, making the life of civilians miserable, as they have been doing for such a long time.
Well, this halt to military activity and indeed the humanitarian pause has been preceded over the last several weeks by intense fighting, as we heard there in the city, with casualties on both sides in eastern Aleppo from airstrikes from Russian and Syrian air forces, which have received quite a widespread coverage in much Western media. But also deaths in western Aleppo, with shelling consistently happening on almost a daily basis from terrorists based in the east of Aleppo, and indeed many children falling victim to that shelling. Our correspondents on the ground there, Murat Gaziev, he's just made another report about the consequence of this, which we can have a look now, but we must warn our viewers that what you're about to see may be distressing.
Aleppo is a city of sad stories. And here's one of them. 10 people, 2 families, living in this one room. Sad, right? Gets sadder.
بحس اجري عم تنقطع مباري هيك من وجع ما بحك وقت هيك ما بعرف ايش بيصير بتحكني.
13-year-old Reem lost her foot in rebel shelling 3 weeks ago. It's been an incredibly painful experience for her. There are no strong enough painkillers to be given to her out of hospital. All the ones available off the shelf are weak. Her life changed on an ordinary day as she was walking home from school. It can happen to anyone, and everyone knows it. It's just that nobody expects it to happen to their own flesh and blood.
ما تصورت يعني انه هيك بنتي في هالموقف هيك. زعلت كثير وقتلت في حال يعني ما بعرف ايش بدي احكي يعني ما بيطلع الكلام ما بعرف.
Reem was lucky, as these things go. She survived a shell blast from just meters away. Yet, how do you explain that to a 13-year-old girl?
ايه انا بدي ترجع اجري. بدي ترجع اجري مثل ما كانت.
That was a sad story. This is a crushingly depressing story. 6-year-old Amr Satut. He took 4 pieces of shrapnel to the head, and nobody knows whether he will ever wake up. The damage to his brain, doctors told us, was enormous. We asked his father if he could, what would he say to the people who did this?
بس هذا إجرام بحق الأطفال. طفل عمره 5 سنين إيش ذنبه؟ إيش ذنبه بيرك جوات بيته لحتى يجي هالشيء هذا؟ إيش سوى؟ إيش هالجرم اللي ارتكبه؟ وين الأمن الأمان كلنا عايشين فيه؟ وين المرحلة اللي وصلنا لها بعد 5 سنين 6 سنين إرهاب؟
A few rooms away was another patient, fresh out of surgery. He's only just learned to walk.
The child is 2 years old. He was shot in the stomach and the operation lasted for 4 hours. He is now stable.
He was hit by a stray bullet, and as long as he lives, he will be reminded daily of a war which began before he was born. 13-year-old Muna, brought in 3 days ago, shrapnel to the head. She's in the same situation. She's in an induced coma. But whether she wakes up or she does not, this bed in this Aleppo hospital won't stay empty for long. Morad Gazdiev, RT in Aleppo.
And replying to a request from RT, the Red Cross called on all parties in the conflict to respect international humanitarian law. Ralph El Haj from the charity told us when it comes to helping civilians, there should be no distinction between East and West Aleppo.
This East and West is something that has been created as a consequence of the current conflict. People on both sides need urgent humanitarian aid, and that will not happen if agreements are not reached. And their situation will deteriorate. People are dying, not only because of the current ongoing fighting, but because of other problems such as access to healthcare, which is almost collapsing on the eastern side. The western side is also suffering from attacks, indiscriminate attacks on civilians, which is totally unacceptable. Again, we're waiting just for all the parties to agree so that we can do our job and help civilians who do not take part in the conflict and who are usually the victims, the first victims of conflicts.
We've also requested comment on the latest attacks from other human rights groups. We are still waiting for a response from UNICEF, as well as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Doctors Without Borders. Meanwhile, our Washington correspondent Gayane Chichikan has been getting reaction from the U.S. State Department to Russia's latest humanitarian initiative in Aleppo.
The U.S. State Department did not sound optimistic about the humanitarian pause announced by Russia for eastern Aleppo.
I guess we'll see. If there is actually an 8-hour pause and the unremitting suffering of the people of Aleppo, that would be a good thing. But frankly, it's a bit too little too late.
One of the things that's in Russia's latest announcement is a call on the rebels and al-Nusra fighters to remove mines and other hazards at humanitarian corridors to allow civilians to leave. The statement says shelter and medical help are guaranteed for all civilians fleeing eastern Aleppo. Last week, when I asked the State Department's John Kirby about the people trying to leave eastern Aleppo, he said they shouldn't have to leave.
They shouldn't have to leave. And they shouldn't be being bombed by their own government and by the Russian military.
Today, as the U.S. is helping Iraqi forces retake Mosul, the UN and the Red Cross say they're preparing for hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing the battle for Mosul. With this, I asked the State Department whether they thought civilians in Mosul shouldn't have to leave.
This is a major military offensive. It's going to take a lot of time. I think we recognize that citizens are going to be, and civilians are going to be displaced. We've seen this before. Elsewhere in Iraq, and we're trying to learn from those past efforts. And by we, I mean collectively, not just the United States, and how to mitigate some of those effects. This displacement that's somewhat inevitable in an operation of this scale.
So when it comes to Russian and Syrian military operations in eastern Aleppo, the State Department says civilians shouldn't have to leave. When it comes to operations backed by the U.S. in Iraq's Mosul, the State Department says the displacement of civilians is, quote-unquote, somewhat inevitable.
Well, the Red Cross said the operation in Mosul will create up to 1 million more displaced civilians. The military advance began 24 hours ago and has already led to some heavy clashes. Political activist Soraya Fars says there would be no need for a humanitarian push in Mosul, Iraq or Aleppo, Syria if there was a serious, united anti-terror campaign.
In Mosul itself, what makes it any different than what's going on in Syria in terms of the displacement and the situation in general? I think that needs to be addressed before we can take a look at any humanitarian effort. What's the difference in terms of freeing Mosul and not taking care of Syria the same way? What they're looking to do is that they couldn't play hero in Syria, so now they plan on doing that in Iraq. By freeing Mosul, what they're doing is that they're going to end up moving the terrorists into Syria if the United States really wants to do any peace effort or humanitarian effort. It would have to be siding with both Russia and the current Syrian government. There would not be a need for humanitarian aid if they do that. They need to stop supporting the terrorism that's going on in Syria.
A Muslim American family from North Carolina are quitting life in the U.S. and moving to Pakistan after their 7-year-old son claims he was beaten on a school bus by his classmates.
They hit me in my face, they hit my chest and stomach, and then they hit my fingers. And they kept saying that my name is a silly name. And they kept calling me bad names. And they said Abdul means you're fat and a bully. It hurts me more because they are my friends. But who bullies friends?
Well, the school says it is investigating the incident and that Abdul's version of events is not supported by other witnesses. We tried to get some clarification by speaking to Abdul's father.
He was beaten, he was bruised, he wasn't talking much, a lot of pain in his hand. So we gave him some pain medicine. The next day when he wakes up, he narrated the ordeal for us. So he said that one of his fellow passengers came to him and asking him why he wanted to eat certain food and why not. He only eat halal, and this is the recurring questions he gets in his cafeteria as well, again and again. And then the other boy says that let's start fighting. And he said, I don't want to fight. But as soon as he says it, he punched him on his face. And then he called two more boys and 2 more girls, and then 5 of them start beating him up. So they've slapped his face, kick in his chest and his stomach, injured a couple of his fingers, twisted his arms, blocked his arms, and thrown away his backpack. So this is what happened with my 7-year-old son, Abdul Aziz.
This summer, another Muslim family moved to Qatar from Texas after their son Ahmed was briefly arrested for bringing a suspicious-looking homemade clock to school. The teacher thought it was a bomb. And though many supported the teenager through his ordeal, he says the hateful attitudes haven't gone away.
I got a lot of support in the beginning, but then again, it's the hate that sticks because some of it is so damaging. I get death threats. What did I ever do to someone to get death threats?
Well, the incident comes at a time when more than half of Americans now have an unfavorable opinion of Islam. That's according to recent polls. In fact, a study showed the media often provides a negative view of the religion as well. In fact, one found almost 60% of the headlines about Muslims in the New York Times were negative, though some U.S. Muslims prefer just to laugh it off.
Burn them all down and deport them all?
Like, I was born here. Where am I going to get deported to? The hospital? Bomb-making class.
I don't remember the last time I took that class. I always skipped it. I don't know why.
I feel in my heart that they are all sleepers here in America. They all hate us and waiting for the
signal to do whatever they are told. This is my opinion, and I forget to explain it.
What signal?
What signal?
The signal. I wonder what kind of signal it would be.
It's supposed to be like a human thing, like a noise, or like
a caw, and all the Muslims are coming. Like, yeah, let's kill them all.
After the break here on RT International, we gauge reaction to the news. The bank accounts of RT UK are being closed. We're back in a moment.
This is Boom Bust, and these are the stories we are tracking for you today.
I think that the euro is severely undervalued.
That's the highest output in over 3 years.
What the Fed really wants is inflation.
The U.S. has more than doubled imports from Iraq.
All that debt that was accumulated, they have to pay it off.
And when you see oil go down, our economy goes down.
What do you make of that data, and what does it really mean for the average worker?
The Tuesday News on RT International. The decision of NatWest Bank to close RT UK's accounts without any explanation has certainly provoked plenty of reaction.
Sending solidarity to RT in the face of outrageous actions by the banks backed by the British government. Anything I can do to help, just let me know.
Well, we launched a hashtag on social media, Banksit, to garner reaction. And while there was plenty of solidarity after the bank said it would no longer provide its services to RT UK, many of our viewers branded the decision arbitrary and an attempt to silence the channel. Others even vowed to boycott NatWest over what they called its, quote, unprofessional action. But while there was much support, there were also those who welcomed the move, some not hesitating to celebrate it as good news. For example, let's show you some tweets here. One tweet saying the bank's decision to close RT's accounts was better late than never. Well, that was the other tweet. For this one, though, another adding that the UK has just grown fed up of relentless Russian propaganda. Well, we took to the streets of London to see what people there thought about this.
How would you feel if you had received a letter in the post saying that your account's been shut with no warning, no explanation given, and that you can't even appeal?
Well, I'll be outraged and disgusted. Like, a bank shouldn't shut your account just like that. Like, there's no good justification for that.
I would feel very frustrated and very scared.
I think I'd be pretty upset. I'd want them to explain why, because, you know, there must be some explanation. There's got to be a reason. You don't do that for the fun of it. NatWest, let's say, shut RT's account. Like, why would you think that would happen?
Maybe something very political, yeah. Because RT haven't got a good sort of reputation in the media background, so that might have something to do with it. what you got to think about, maybe it might be from above. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah, because if you guys are giving information people don't want you to give.
The letter said we're not interested in discussing it, so... Oh, right, so your account's closed, go away. Thanks very much. Basically. Yeah. Charming.
If that was the first I knew about it, I wouldn't be very happy. So, don't be happy.
Thank you very much.
Although initially the bank said the decision was not subject to revision, after several hours it then stated that it was reviewing the situation. Here's RT's Polly Boyka.
RT's UK bureau is in search of a new bank. NatWest, which announced that it would no longer service RT's accounts, is owned by the Royal Bank of Scotland, whose biggest shareholder is the British government. And the British government hasn't exactly been known to lavish praise on RT's output.
Well, I know that Russia today is the favoured channel of the Labour leadership.
The assumption is that taking RT seriously is a bit of a joke. But in actual fact, the British government has been taking RT seriously.
There is a war of information and a war of propaganda going on, which we are singularly losing in the West.
Even Lords are baffled by the channel's success.
RT, as it's called, it's a very effective propaganda channel. It has a very large following now, and it's only been running for a few years, so don't underestimate it.
British politicians have been so concerned about being outgunned by Russian and Chinese broadcasters that last year the government allocated an extra £289 million for the BBC World Service. When RT launched in the UK, some Westminster pundits suggested a boycott. Respected editors say working for RT deems you unemployable in future.
I think we could do a bit more with ostracism. I'm quite happy to say that if anyone puts a CV on my desk, and on that CV I see they worked at RT or Sputnik or one of these things, that CV is going into the bin.
While over on British commercial radio, the mere mention of RT can prompt the mother of all rants.
Certain people. Onto RT, and it's on there today.
RT, let me tell you, Brian, about RT. By the way, let me tell you about RT. RT is a successor media channel owned by the Russian state. What I'm astounded by, what I am shocked by, in fact, what I'm appalled at, is a number of, nominally liberal, democratic, human rights advocating British citizens succumbing to Russian propaganda.
I apologize for interrupting that there. We're now going to cross live to a conference where the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is answering questions from journalists after meeting with his Paraguayan counterpart. Let's listen in.
Russia suspending its airstrikes in Aleppo. This is a goodwill gesture. We expect that this pause that we have announced will be used to finally separate Jabhat al-Nusra and similar groups from the militias supported and armed by the United States, some European countries, and some of the regional powers. They promised to do that for a long time, at least since February, but they never did it, under various pretexts, and we are actually wondering if this position of our Western colleagues is because our Western partners want to spare al-Nusra and use it later to oust Bashar al-Assad, even though they keep telling us that this is not their intention, and this definitely goes against all the decisions by the UN Security Council. Still, when we had a meeting last Saturday in Lausanne in Switzerland with John Kerry and representatives of a number of regional countries, we agreed that we'll get our military experts working together in Geneva to finally work out what I just mentioned, to separate the so-called moderate opposition from Jabhat al-Nusra. There are different ways to accomplish that. You can just drive Jabhat al-Nusra from this area, and we will naturally support this approach because this is part of the de Mistura plan. But Those who don't want to be associated with terrorists will naturally have to sign a ceasefire agreement, like the agreement between Russia and the U.S. adopted a long time ago stipulated, and UN Security Council resolutions as well. So yes, there was an agreement achieved in Lausanne that our military expert will do their best to work this out, and we'll have a meeting in Geneva tomorrow. We'll see what will come out of it. You also asked about Mosul. Mosul is a city, is a major city with 1.5 million civilians living there, and naturally we have been following this offensive. We all want to see the so-called Islamic State defeated. The city has not been encircled entirely, as far as I know. I don't know what's the reason for it. I just hope that it's because they were not able to encircle it entirely. Anyway, there is this corridor left, and there is a certain risk that ISIL fighters may leave Iraq and go to Syria instead. So we will keep track of the situation and respond politically and militarily accordingly. And if this happens, and if they go to Syria, where we have our forces operating based on the legitimate request of the legitimate government, if there are more ISIL fighters going in there, we'll have to respond. This offensive is a complicated one. It will involve airstrikes, just like in Aleppo, and ground forces as well, I believe. And actually, there is a large number of troops involved in this offensive. And it's important for the region that there is even a rivalry between different groups as to whose forces will get into Mosul first. There are some Shia forces, there are Kurds, Turkey. You know that there is a Turkish expeditionary force there, and the Iraqi leadership is very much opposed to it, and there are also 1,500 U.S. special forces officially. They are there as advisors, but of course 1,500 advisors is quite a huge number. So who will be part of this ground force? This will very much affect the situation in the region. This will very much determine the role played by Turkey, the role that Kurds will have in all these processes. And we have long been saying that there is a need to normalize relations between the Sunni and Shia Muslims, so it will also affect this situation as well. And as far as humanitarian situation in Mosul is concerned, the number of refugees, civilian refugees, may be, the range is very wide, from 200,000 to almost 1 million people. We have this figure, 900,000 refugees, Iraq, Syria, other neighboring countries where these refugees can go to. Nobody has the capacity to receive so many refugees. So we just hope that those who launched this offensive considered all these factors and options. And then you asked this third question about the intention to freeze RT's bank accounts without any explanations. Well, we made some comments yesterday. Our spokesperson talked about the issue, and it is perfectly clear that the decision was not made by the bank, not by any bank. In fact, no bank can make this decision on its own. And the situation is very obvious. You know what they say. never treat others the way you don't want to be treated yourself. And that's all I have to say on the issue.
Dear colleagues, if there are no more questions, our press conference will be over, and thank you very much.
Sorry for interrupting there very quickly. It's RT International there, the Russian foreign minister there addressing reporters in downtown central Moscow, covering issues of the ongoing offensive against ISIL in Mosul, Iraq. Also, the humanitarian pause in effect starting on Thursday, although military action has now stopped in Aleppo to prepare the way for that humanitarian pause. For now, though, here on RT International, always bear in mind, get more details on our website. For now, on air, though, it's boom bust.